Beastcoast Pokemon, what is up? Today, James and I are going to be doing another kind of metagame slash tournament breakdown for some of the big national championships that have happened in the last couple of weeks. Now, as you may know, the circuit only has one tournament left, and that's the World Championships taking place in London next month. And the metagame definitely has shifted around a little bit, and we saw some really interesting results in teams across the last couple of months. And James, of course, got top 8 at NAIC as well, so he can kind of speak to his experience at that tournament. But yeah, we're going to be covering Taiwan nationals, Hong Kong nationals, Japan nationals, and NAIC. So yeah, James, let's dive into things. Hey guys, Cybertron. Relax, I was just gonna get there. Anyway, as this little buddy was saying, 80% of you aren't subscribed to the channel, so hit that subscribe button. It really helps. Hey, what Pokemon are you?
Yeah, first up, I guess we got the Taiwan National Championship, and the first place, no surprise, it's been Lunadon, and I feel like Lunadon during the time period, basically a very popular team choice because Groudon, of course, really solid, Lunala, of course, with the Trick Room, and then, of course, some really strong Sun options like Charizard and Venusaur are always very tricky to play around, so no surprise there. You have multiple forms of speed control with like Grimmsnarl and the Lunala, and it's just a very disruptive team. And of course, Lunala, one of the big parts of it compared to like Shadow Rider Calyx, which we've been seeing, is the Meteor Beam, being able to actually threaten Incineroar, for instance, on the Switch, able to threaten Charizard. It's just a really strong pick, and we definitely been seeing a lot more influences around this time period where Lunala and Groudon have been doing really well at the recent events.
Yeah, I feel like this is an archetype that's really come, full force in maybe the last month and a half or so. What's interesting, I think, is there's so many different ways you can run it in terms of, the Charizard item, very much like Ringia Sun, right? Like you can use Life Orb, you can use Chardy Berry. With Venusaur, there are a lot of different variants as well. Policy, Life Orb, Focus Sash, just to name a couple. Nakoba Berry as well. The Groudons on these teams can be, Citrus Berry with either Swords Dance or even Bulk Up with Leftovers. Actually, Bulk Up plus Leftovers won Vancouver Regionals, piloted by Gavin Michaels. And so there's a lot of flexibility in kind of the sets that you want to run, right? You could also run like Trick Iron Ball and Grimmsnarl rather than the Light Clay dual screens. But the team that won the Taiwanese national championships had Life Orb Charizard, Policy Venusaur, standard kind of Light Clay dual screen Scrim, and then just Power with, the standard Lunala set. I think Lunala also maybe now sees a little bit more flexibility where you can run like Moonlight or Wide Guard over Protect. But overall, yeah, this has been a pretty dominant composition and was, one of the more common and represented comps at NAIC as well. So not really surprising to see it take a major victory here. But I think if you scroll down, the second place team in itself is really interesting because it has Latios and Snorlax.
Yeah, this team was actually based off a ladder team that I think it was like May or earlier. I think it was April actually, with a Latios team with the exact same partners, but was changed up a little bit with the Latios, which was pretty interesting. It kind of, because the Latios set was actually like solo Icy Wind as the attack move, all other support moves with like Tailwind, Ally, Switch. So this Latios actually was way more offensive with the Energy Ball and Psyshock. So a pretty interesting adjustment to do well. And yeah, there is definitely some surprises. We even saw, like, for instance, we saw like a Sneasel in the 6th place right there, and that was actually a very similar team that the user used to actually, I think, do well at the regional championship, had a Alolan Persian over the Sneasel. So we're just seeing like people play some comfort picks, but maybe adding a little bit more of their own twist to it to fit their style.
Yeah, definitely. I think, with this nationals, like couple surprises for sure. Like, two Snorlaxes in the top 8. That Snorlax set featured was in second place was Thick Fat with Leftovers, and it was Double Edge, Steel Roller, Curse, and Yawn. So it was kind of this interesting kind of anti-meta pick where you've got Thick Fat to counter a lot of the common Pokemon out right now, whether it be Charizard or Calyrex Ice Rider. And then, Yawn and Curse is just incredibly disruptive against Trick Room-oriented compositions, and Calyrex Ice Rider plus Palkia is still running around, right? And so I think Snorlax in itself, not a Pokemon we've seen too much in the meta before, and this team definitely kind of opened my eyes to it a little bit more. And then within the top 8, you also have like Yveltal plus Calyrex Shadow Rider with the Ditto, which I think is really interesting, kind of more hyper offense oriented, where you try to set up Tailwind and really just, overwhelm your opponent with offense. You called out the Sneasel. We've got, Snorlax with Calyrex Shadow Rider and Groudon. And then a lot of pretty standard kind of Zacian Groudon, Zacian Kyogre teams, Lunala Groudon. But I think this this tournament definitely had some really interesting restricted pairs. Like there's a Solgaleo plus Calyrex Shadow Rider at 14th place, and then a Reshiram and Calyrex Shadow Rider at 12th. But overall, yeah, Lunala Groudon was able to take home the entire tournament. And I think, as we've kind of talked about, it is just one of the more consistent compositions at the moment, it feels like.
Yeah, it's definitely something we saw rising, and we're definitely going to see more of it as we go along this list. But let's move over to the next national championship, which I believe is Hong Kong, if I'm not mistaken. Hong Kong Nationals. Now, this was a very, very interesting tournament, to say the least, if you look at the results right here. We have 2 Solgaleo Kyogres in the top 4, with the winning team Zacian Kyogre, but it's really different from the conventional ones. We have Tornadus and Landorus, which are pretty standard, but then you also have Thundurus, so it's actually a triple genie on this team with Celesteela, which is a Pokemon we really just don't see that often right here. And yeah, it's definitely pretty interesting to have 4 Flying Mons on the same team. So I don't know, what are your thoughts about that one?
Yeah, first of all, I mean, the player let one, Ponzi Ming, like, I believe that they go by China Sapphire online, and they've just been like an incredible online player. Like I've used a lot of their teams, and they're always like super high up on the ladder. And so I think they actually might have used a version of this team to get like top 30 in one of the ranked seasons. And like the Celesteela in itself is really interesting. I'm not sure what that set was. I don't know if like a paste or a rental ever came out for it. But I know that they recently used like a Power Herb Celesteela on ladder this last rank season. So either way, Celesteela feels like a Pokemon that's a little bit maybe underplayed in the format. Obviously can wall a lot of common threats, especially something like Zacian, which at best can Sacred Sword into it. And then Triple Genie is also interesting because, yeah, it's just so much kind of offense coming out from it, especially Landorus. Tornadus, Kyogre, Zacian has been a really common core recently. But this is definitely a slightly different take, right? Where you normally see something like Kartana over Celesteela, and maybe things like Incineroar over like the Thundurus. And so to me, this team has a lot of flexibility and like the number of Dynamax options. And obviously with so many flying types, you have a lot of max airstream potential as well.
Absolutely. But I mean, looks like we have laid the exact same team for 2nd and 3rd place, Solgaleo Kyogre, and both of them having the Charizard. I actually wonder if these are the exact same teams and they were just like team building partners, but I think it's pretty interesting to see a Charizard right here. There's no Whimsicott, so there's no Sunny Day action. And I don't know. I don't think there's an official set, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was like a Bulldoze Charizard with Voice Scarf, for instance. Even on this team, I could definitely see it. But it's definitely just interesting to see Solgaleo Kyogre do this well, especially since in order for China Sapphire to win this tournament, he had to play the Solgaleo Kyogre, which doesn't look like a fun matchup. So it's definitely, I wonder what had impacts in that match specifically.
Solgaleo, just something that's always been kind of a fringe restricted pick, where I was a big fan of it in the start of the format. I feel like it kind of fell off, especially as Calyrex Shadow Rider and Lunala became more common. So I'm actually really impressed to see, it finish both 2nd and 3rd. I think, one of the upsides of Solgaleo is that it can be kind of anti-meta, just as in it does super well into Zacian, and Zacian's obviously still so common across the board. So what I think interesting in this top 4, actually, there's only one Zacian. Otherwise, you've got Solgaleo Kyogre, Yveltal Kyogre. And once again, it just reaffirms, I think, the strength of either Kyogre or Groudon in this format. It feels like most, of the teams that are doing really well feature normally one of the two, unless you're using something like Zacian Calyrex, which I know, James, you have some experience with, and it actually did place 5th at this tournament as well.
Yeah, and then some very obscure picks with the Zamazenta actually in the 6th place right there, which has actually been seen pretty well known in high ladder of Battle Stadium for the last couple of seasons by one specific player. But yeah, there is also the Kyurem White Calyx Shadow Rider with the Talonflame. It looks like a little bit of an adjustment maybe from the US, because Cortex has been using like that kind of combo for quite a bit now and has been doing really well consistently throughout the regional seasons. I think top cutting like 2 or 3 using Calyx Shadow Rider plus Kyurem. And it's just really an interesting pick because, again, we've seen meta, and then we've seen like a little bit of those obscure restrictors, but that do really well. For instance, Solgaleo, as you mentioned before, does really well against like Zacian, Kyogre, but Kyurem White actually does really well against a lot of different Groudon teams, especially if they don't have the Steel type.
When I first saw the team, it immediately reminded me of Nathan Ortiz's team, which, had Custap Berry Talonflame, which I think was a really interesting set. But some different changes here. Galarian Moltres is something that actually won a regional championship in Italy, and it's kind of used as an anti-Lunala Groudon tech because you have pretty good resistances or immunities, and you of course still have to worry about rock type attacks, whether it be Meteor Beam from Lunala or something like a Stone Edge or Max Rockfall from Groudon. But if you position the Galarian Moltres well, like, you can get a lot of value out of it for a non-restricted Pokemon, and it's basically kind of like a budget Evoltal, right? So yeah, I think one thing that I was also intrigued in seeing was like 2 Evoltals in the top 8. I feel like if anything, Evoltal's kind of fallen off a little bit. So it's cool to see that in this regional meta, like, actually the top 8 restricteds were really diverse, right? In terms of pairing, like Zacian Kyogre, Solgaleo Kyogre, Evoltal Kyogre, Zacian Calyrex. And it continues to trend in this format, which is that, like, there's so many restricted pairs that are viable. And so, of course, you often see Zacian Kyogre as some Zacian pairing, like, winning the event. But at the same time, like, there's so many, like, can perform well and make it to that top 8. And that's been a trend since day 1 of this format. I feel like it's continued here in this tournament.
Yeah, especially since I feel like Yveltal, as you mentioned before, fell off quite a bit, but I feel like it's mainly, especially in the US meta, we don't really see that many Yveltals, especially towards the later parts of the season, but I feel like Asia actually still really likes Yveltal, so kind of curious on how that's going to affect Worlds, and like, will the US players focus on what they've seen so far, or I think that most of them will probably focus on the overall meta, and Yveltal is definitely a threat you have to respect, for sure.
Absolutely. So yeah, I think this top 8, looking at it just really excited me, especially seeing Solgaleo, and it's cool, like, to see Hong Kong just in general, get more official support as well. So I'm really excited to see how the players that have qualified for Worlds perform there. But let's move on to the next event. This one may be the most exciting just because there were some really crazy teams here, and that's of course the Japanese National Championships.
Oh man, Japan Nationals is like one of the most hype events to watch. They have a really nice production setup too, if you have watched their stream. But looking at these teams, if you look at the top 32 teams, you might be like looking at this and it's like, what the heck is going on there? There's so much. For instance, and even like some of the teams, like, they look okay. They look like, okay, you could probably see this, and then you look at their sets and they're like, oh, that's what it is. For instance, let's save the first place. We have second place here, and I have faced this player on ladder quite a few times actually. It's a double choice restricted team with Choice Scarf Yveltal and Choice Specs Kyogre, which the Yvel Ogre we don't really see, and then you have those techs and then it really just surprises you, which of course one of the things about Japan Nats that's really interesting is that they play a best of 1 Swiss, and then their top 32 is actually best of 3. So it's actually always interesting, I think, to watch, because these teams have to do well in best of 1 and best of 3, which I think is always an interesting concept.
Yeah, for sure. Like, I think, you definitely have more room to use maybe slightly unexpected strategies that can really give you an edge in best of 1, because I believe it was like the top 50 players maybe qualify for Worlds. And so if you make it to the top 32, using some more best of 1 oriented strats, then you can guarantee your spot at Worlds. And so it makes sense to have some, big surprises that your opponents are just never really going to expect in best of 1. Well, what's interesting is that I believe it was open team sheets for top 32 onwards. And so, some of your surprises actually really just gets spoiled a little bit once you're in that top 32. So to me, it's really impressive that despite it being open team sheet, like, this Evoltal Kyogre combination still managed to, make it all the way to the finals, because it's a pretty big deal to let your opponents know you already have Scarf on Evoltal and Specs on Kyogre. And so either way, though, I think there's so many scary things to fight against here, right? And what this team does is really just like punch holes really quickly. You can even lead something like Evoltal Kyogre and just go for something like a Scarf Tailwind into Specs Water Spout immediately. And the team relies on kind of Dynamaxing Zapdos and Kartana in the end game to, really just sweep through, especially with max airstream pressure as well. And Safety Goggles Shedinja is a set that we've seen a lot recently. This thing is just a nightmare to play against, right? It's like, there's Ally Switch, you have no idea when your opponent's going to click it. And with Goggles, it can actually protect itself from max hailstorms or, just weather conditions. And then Endure just allows it to survive forever as well. So yeah, it's one of those teams that, like, you stare down and you're just like, this is a nightmare to go up against.
Yeah, and then there's so many fun Pokemon here. We have 2 Eternatus in the top 8 of Japan Nats, which we really don't see. Like, the only Eternatus I think we've really seen so far was like Vancouver, where John, who I believe used to get top 8 at that event, but like Japan bringing out the Eternatus, I believe it was, not mistaken, Life Orb and Specs. One of them was definitely Life Orb. I don't remember if the other one is. Oh no, they were actually both Life Orb. Life Orb is pretty interesting because Dynamax Cannon does so much damage from this Pokemon, and they're actually both modest nature, so I thought that was actually pretty interesting as well. And then, I mean, if we could scroll down more, like there's Golisopod, a dual weather Pokemon in the 8th place right there, and I think it's always interesting. I think Golisopod's a really cool support Pokemon. We also see stuff like Clefairy, which is pretty interesting niche, Sableye, of course, Dragapult. We actually see like multiple Clefairies, and then just barely missing out that top 32, we saw like Sylveon, Cinderace, Blacephalon. There were some pretty crazy picks for this Nationals in general.
Yeah, it's such a different like contrast from the North American metagame, and even just talking about the Eternatus teams, like so the first one, this team was just crazy. Like it managed to get top 4. The player managed to make it to day 2, Kaori Ueki, which is just so impressive. Like it's a triple dragon team with Eternatus, Dialga, Salamence. It was White Herb Salamence, Expert Belt Dialga, and then you had Whimsicott, Umbreon, and Urshifu for support. So with the team, you're almost always maxing Dialga, but Salamence can max in the right situation as well. This is just so far removed from anything I have played or seen this format, and like you mentioned, like Eternatus just does a ton of damage, right? And this Pokemon has a really good speed stat as well. I think having a way to get a one-hit KO onto Grimmsnarl in this format is also valuable because Grimm is just such a crazy strong option on every team. And Eternatus with the Life Orb Sludge Bomb, as well as Dialga with that Max Steel Spike, or even just Expert Belt Steel Beam, can really get rid of Grimmsnarl as quickly as possible. And so, yeah, I mean, when I saw this team, I was already, my mind was blown, but then to see it make it all the way to the top 4 was even more impressive. And so I think I've definitely been more interested in Eternatus ever seeing this team. And then the other Eternatus team, I don't know, James, if you saw the pace, but it's even crazier. It's Focus Sash, Jolly, Calyrex Ice Rider with Speed Swap, Charty Berry, Charizard with Helping Hand, Scorching Stance, Hurricane Blast Burn, Modest AV, Alecki, Bold, Babiri, Whimsicott with Endeavor, Tail, and Fake Tears and Sunny Day, and then the Instant and Eternatus maybe a little bit more standard. But once again, I mean, like Eternatus plus Calyrex Ice Rider, I don't think I've ever seen that duo before this team.
Yeah, it's really crazy. I think like some of the text on the teams in general. I'm assuming the Whimsicott's probably like Eevee to survive a Behemoth Blade from Zacian, get the tail up, and then a surprise Endeavor might really get some players, and it might actually set up it. I don't know what the Whimsicott is, but it's probably faster than the Calyrex Ice Rider, and that Endeavor into Glacial Lands under the tail and would be a really big threat. But yeah, just looking at this Nationals, I think one Pokemon that really stands out to me, and I think it's like a pretty big influence for that we saw, was Umbreon. Umbreon has kind of been absent for most of the meta in general. We saw a bit of it in the beginning, but we haven't really seen it much recently until Japan Nationals. It really started popping in. For instance, Hirofumi, who got second place at Worlds in 2019, actually used Umbreon and placed top 16 in this event with Umbreon. And I feel like the Dialga team, the one that got top 4, the Triple Dragon team, actually really complements Umbreon well, because you have Intimidate from Salamence, and you have a way to boost up Umbreon's defenses with Steel Spike and Quake. I think that's a common factor we've also seen, for instance, on Hirofumi's team with the Groudon going for Max Quakes next to the Umbreon. And it just really makes it hard to KO, and it does really well against like Calyrex Ice Rider Palkia. A lot of them opted for like the taunts, maybe Foul Player Snarl sets, and it's just a really big pain for like some teams that don't have a good Umbreon answer, especially if they're not running the Zacians that have been kind of falling off recently. Can be a really big threat to teams for them to actually take out.
Yeah, I mean, Hirofumi, by the way, like, I just want to talk about his accomplishments because he won Japanese Nationals back-to-back in 18-19 and then was, like, I think one of the clear favorites to win Worlds in 2019 and then made it all the way to the finals, losing to Naoto in the final match. But, of course, he had Umbreon back then in 2019, brought it to this tournament. Also, just a really interesting team. It was Expert Belt, Tornadus, AV Groudon, once again, Focus Sash, Calyrex Ice Rider, Charty Berry on Charizard, and Life Orb Alecki. So Calyrex plus Groudon, definitely not a very common restricted pairing either. So I think one of my favorite things from this Nationals is seeing players who are really high level explore like new restricted pairings that I think are very unique, right? And Sash on Calyrex is really interesting because we've seen a couple of that from this tournament, but it makes sense because it gives you a way to obviously survive Behemoth Blade from Zacian while also pressuring with Trick Room, and then still be able to deal damage. Like you survive Behemoth Blade, you set up Trick Room, and then just Glacial Lance or High Horsepower under Trick Room. So I think this team was just really interesting because you've got like the Tailwind and the Trick Room support. And speaking of notable players, of course, our world champion from 2019, Naoto Mitsubishi, managed to get top 8 with a Calyrex Ice Rider and Zacian team. This one being Policy Calyrex Ice Rider.
Yeah, this team is pretty crazy as well, and like normally this would be, I think most of players would assume Shadow Rider with Zacian at least, but no, it's actually the Ice Rider with a Trick Room option. It also had a Porygon 2 that featured no recover. It was Tri-Attack, Shadow Ball, Trick Room, and Protect. So definitely some interesting factors, including the Gastrodon, which had recover, no Ice Beam, Earth Power, Yawn, recover, Protect with a Rindo Berry. So pretty interesting text. I kind of wondered like how the player schedules were, because I feel like with this Japan Nationals there's so many unique teams on the field, and it really I think can really go either way, because there's just so many things that you could possibly be facing. Like if you were playing, like if you were in this top 32 for instance, how would you react? Because a lot of these teams I don't think you would probably commonly see in general unless they somehow face each other during practice games. But it's just crazy that I think in general just to see like all these different teams, and then like how does your interactions happen, because like most likely you probably have not faced most of these teams before this event.
That's a really good point, right? It's like in this format people rely on experience, but you're gonna have so little experience against so many of these restricted duos and just crazy sets, so you kind of have to improvise a little bit. I think for Naoto's team, yeah, the Porygon 2 definitely the most interesting part, and I think Protect on Porygon is such a rare attack. So in best of one, players will often double up onto Porygon, especially even committing a max move, because they feel like it's really easy to double into it safely. So Protect can just stall out so much pressure from your opponent immediately. But I think the general idea behind this team is that you can use either Calyrex or Thundurus as really strong max options. Thundurus Zacian obviously super impressive. And then Porygon 2 can self-Shadow Ball Calyrex to activate Policy, or Shadow Ball opposing Calyrex Shadow Riders or Lunalas. Shadow Ball in general, just kind of a strong option on it. Foul Play is the other one that you'll see, but Shadow Ball may be a little bit better here to activate your Weakness Policy without dealing too much damage to your own Calyrex Ice Rider. But yeah, I mean, these teams were all just crazy, and I think what I do want to focus on a little bit now is actually the winning team, because it actually looks a lot more maybe standard than most of the other teams in this tournament. Of course, using the Zacian Kyogre combination with Tornadus, which we talked about a little bit. But, some pretty interesting item choices is actually AV on Kyogre, Life Orb on Landorus, and then the White Herb on Kartana with no Protect on it.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. We actually don't even know the Amoonguss item, actually. I think that's just wasn't translated, but yeah, I mean, we've seen a lot of Kyogres. Assaultvest has probably taken one of the #1 item choices recently in general, but usually when you see Tornadus, you would imagine it's a more offensive item. We've seen Life, for instance, get second place at EUIC, and Mystic Water is probably the most common variant on these Tornadus teams, so it's pretty interesting to see how the Kyogre Assault Vest would change some of the matchups and the dynamics of it. And then you have, for instance, the Jolly Fast Zacian, which a lot of players depends, because we've seen, I think, for instance, Tornadus, Zacian, Kyogre back in top 4 of EUIC from Victor. They used I believe, a really fast Zacian with like no bulk, and just to do a lot of damage with the lead of Tornadus Zacian. So I'm pretty curious if it was that set, and I'm pretty sure it was. And then just like really offensive things in general, because a lot of times you just really want to like go really fast and just outspeed your opponent and just maintain control, right? You want to get the tail end of a Tornadus, Icy Wind to slow them their side down, and then just pick up as quick knockouts as possible while going for like max airstreams with like Landorus or Kartana, and maybe just trying to stack some boosts on top of it. And the Tornadus, I think having a Leer is just a really fun set in general, because Leer probably changes some of the calcs with like the Life or Blando and the Kartana, for instance, and maybe could like pick up some knockouts, especially through like maybe screens. So it's a very cool tech for sure.
Yeah, if you just think about the number of physical attackers on the team, I think White Herb Kartana here is also a cool call out. I feel like Assault Vest is the item that a lot of players expect, maybe Focus Sash sometimes, but you really like having Sash on Tornadus here. And so with Kartana with White Herb and 4 attacks, like basically the idea is that this turns into an absolutely crazy Dynamax option in the late game, because Incineroar can't really slow down its offensive pressure when you can get rid of the Intimidate boost from White Herb. and then you can just chain like Max Airstreams or Max Knuckles really, really quickly. And so, you occasionally see Detect over one of the 4 attacks, but I think a lot of players value all 4 because you want Aerial Ace for the speed boost. You want your same type attack bonus attacks in Leaf Blade and Smart Strike. And then you want Sacred Sword for Max Knuckle because not only can it boost Cortana's attack, it's also valuable, offense into Incineroar. And then you can also boost like Zacian and Landorus's attack. So overall, like there's a lot of different ways you can run this team, and we'll talk about it a little bit more since this versions of this team actually did very well at NAIC as well. But in the end, like I'm not surprised to see this take home first place because it has a couple surprises, whether it be Leer Tornadus, whether Cortana, AV Kyogre, or the Mungus here had Pollen Puff, I believe. But it also is just consistent enough where you don't need to rely on surprises solely to win. So that's, I think, the ideal kind of team that you want to use if you're trying to win an entire tournament, especially in this structure with best of 1 and best of 3.
For sure. And can we also shout out that there are 7 different restricted pairs, I believe, in the 7 different restricted pairs in the top 8 of Japan now.
Yeah.
So, oh boy, preparing for Worlds meta, it's gonna be pretty interesting to see what the results will be, because I think we've seen a lot in the past. For instance, in like 2016, there was some diversity, but not nearly as much. We saw the big ones generally, and then 2019 it got way more diverse. But I feel like a lot of the 22 Series 12 stuff has been off the charts realistically. So I'm kind of curious if there'll be a consensus of like which duos that players will want to pick, or will there just be like people just using what they're comfortable with, what they can think that could like draw off others. It'll just be very interesting to see, I think. And Japan's definitely one of the regions that definitely can like surprise people, especially at Worlds.
Yeah, I gotta say, I think if I were playing in Worlds, like it'd be nearly impossible to prepare for the Japanese teams based off what we've seen from Nationals. And I think that's really interesting because in previous Worlds, like you look at 2015 and 2016, a lot of the really strong Japanese players just opted to use what was maybe like objectively the best team throughout the season. So in 2015, that was kind of the chalk team with Cresselia, Heatran, Amoonguss, Landorus, Kangaskhan, and then you'd have Thundurus. And Shoma Honami won Worlds with that team essentially. 2016, Big Six was the main team, right? It was Kangaskhan, Xerneas, Primal Groudon, Smeargle, Talonflame, and that team, I wouldn't say completely fell off at Worlds, but players went really hard to prepare for it. And I think a lot of Japanese players brought it to Worlds that year. And Japan just had a really weak showing at Worlds that year. So from this Japanese Nationals, it feels like players are really willing to lean into creativity, really crazy restricted pairs, really crazy tech mons. So I personally am so excited to see what they bring to Worlds, especially, some of the big name players like Naoto, obviously, who's coming to defend his title.
Yeah, and even Hirofumi having to go through day 1 of Worlds will be pretty interesting, because he like surprised everyone, I think, with the Umbreon Necrozma bring in 2019. And while Naoto actually just stuck with his comfort pick, I think he just brought an edited version of his nationals team that he used. So it's just always going to be interesting to see for certain, and especially since we got like more Japanese players in this Worlds than any other Worlds, because there have been 2 Japan nationals technically, so all of them have invites. So this is going to be a very heavy tournament for Japan, and it's just going to be super exciting to see like what they bring.
For sure. Before we move to NAIC, there's just some, I want to scroll down and call out like some of the really interesting sets. There was a Tangrowth here in top 32 that was a Focus Sash Chlorophyll set paired with Groudon. So the idea is, you can not only Sleep Powder, but Rage Powder as well. So it's kind of the best combination of Venusaur plus Amoonguss. And so that's super interesting. That team was paired with Assault Vest Groudon as well as Choice Specs, Calyrex Shadow Rider. Tangrowth, not a Pokemon we've seen too much, but I think with the Groudon pairing, it makes a ton of sense. There was the dual Groudon Kyogre team that you mentioned that had Life Orb Groudon with Giga Impact and Thunder Punch on Groudon. So no Fire type attack, no Rock type attack. Assault Vest Kyogre here. And then a Golisopod with Silver Powder, Leech Life, Drill Run, Sucker Punch, and First Impression. Once again, not a Pokemon I'd ever prepare for, and if I fought against it in a tournament, I honestly would not know like what it fully did. And so that element of surprise once again can be valuable. But honestly, like if you just scroll through the top 32, like you'll see more crazy teams than non-crazy teams. There's also a weakness policy Necrozma with Dragon Dance, some Steel Strike, EQ, Rock Slide. And so yeah, I just have been really impressed by all the teams here. Like I think a lot are probably not super easy to execute in best of 3, but once again, you have to consider like the tournament structure for this. And before we finish, we have to talk about 2015 World Champion Shoma Honami. He used Lunala plus Eviltal with Lumberry on Lunala with Hypnosis and Cosmic Power and Moonlight, and then Weakness Policy on Eviltal. This team was just crazy.
Yeah, there are definitely some crazy teams. Shouts to the Hovel player that brought Ho and Dragapult. I mean, yeah, there's just so many interesting picks right here, and I, as someone who is playing in day 2, I'm really glad I'm not playing day 1 Worlds this year. I can definitely tell you, because it's gonna be a nightmare, because you have all these different countries, different play styles, different restricted preferences, and oh boy, trying to get through that gauntlet with like 8 or 9 rounds is definitely something that's gonna be like one of the toughest day 1s I think ever.
What was really fun for me from this tournament is like you look at some of the most well-known players, you know, obviously Shoma and Naoto being previous world champions, as well as Hirofumi, and they all use restricted pairings that like aren't considered like top tier, right? Like Eviltal, Lunala, Calyrex, Ice Rider, Zacian, and then Groudon plus Calyrex, Ice Rider. And so clearly the best of the best from Japan are also willing to use like really obscure stuff, which I think is awesome. But there's just so much we could talk about from this tournament. I think we've hit most of the main points, but yeah, all the top 32 teams are on victory road, and they have pastes without EV spreads, so you can see the movesets that players ran on all of the Pokemon. But that leads us to the final event, which is NAIC. And this one, honestly, maybe a very stark contrast from Japan in terms of kind of, creativity and maybe interesting restricted pairings.
Yeah, I think it also comes down to the structure, right? Most of the players who were going to this event either needed a really, really deep run in order to like get their world invite. I think a lot of players probably needed like the top 16 or even further, for instance, and there were some players who basically were just there to get maybe the top 64 for points. So I think those were like the biggest benchmarks. So a lot of players just ended up, I think, most likely either going all in, and that of course could go for a downfall. It's a double-edged sword, or they just ended up deciding to play safe and pick what they were really comfortable with and what was already proven to be very strong in this meta. So I think it's definitely a different dynamic compared to Japan Nats and a bunch of other nationals that we've seen so far.
Yeah, to me, like NAIC was the story of players just using what they felt most comfortable with for the most part. Like I didn't see any like crazy metagame calls for the most part from day 2, which had around 50-ish players or so. Or sorry, just under 50 players, I believe. But actually, was day 2 32 players exactly?
Yep, it was 32 players. It was a hard 32.
Yeah, I was scrolling down. It had all these other teams past top 32, but yeah, it was just 32 for day 2. But for the most part, it was a lot of players relying on what they've used throughout the entire season or the last couple of months. James Evans did win with Calyrex, Shadow Rider, and Groudon, and that's one of the first non-Zacian teams to take home a victory. But James, I think, really perfecting that archetype, playing super well in the finals against Gabriel Gatti as well. And we were just talking about like the Kyogre, Tornadus, Zacian core. Gabriel actually had a super slow Zacian that was designed to be slower than Cortana. So Cortana could max Airstream or max Knuckle and then give Zacian an attack boost or speed boost before Zacian gets a move off, which I thought was really, really interesting. Otherwise, if you look through the top 8, it's like Calyrex Palkia, Lunala Groudon, Zacian Groudon, and Zacian Calyrex Shadow Rider with you, of course, James. So a lot of comfort picks here. And like you mentioned, due to the tournament structure, it's a little bit harder for, I think, like really big surprises to sneak all the way to the top, unless it's like completely anti-meta, but I think people might be saving that for Worlds.
Yeah, I think James did get top 4 at the Milwaukee Regional Championship, which was a week before, using the exact same 6, and I'm pretty sure that he either like slightly changed it or kept it the same right there. Gabrielle was actually using that team for a couple of months actually on the Showdown ladder. I know that for a fact. Justin's been, of course, going really in, making some slight changes to the Calyrex Ice Rider Palkia. Joe, very well known for using Sun, especially Groudon and Venusaur, and this time actually switched it up using a Lunala instead of like his common Yveltal. Chonjun uses Salt Lake City regional wing team, the Rinya Sun, but slight edits compared to the original, going with the Life Orb Charizard instead of the Charty Berry set from before. The Grimstall set is actually changed right now, and with the Trick set with I believe it's no light screen. Yeah, it's no light screen. It's Trick Thunder Wave, so that's pretty interesting. And then Zay, a player from China, which I think is pretty interesting here because he won the Milwaukee Regional Championship the week before with a Yveltal plus Groudon team, and then completely changed it up with a Shadow Rider team. So I thought that was really impressive, being able to pilot this team basically that plays very different from Yveltal Groudon. This team, I didn't really use it much after EIC, but when I was prepping for EIC, because I was potentially wanting to go, this was the team that I used, and it was probably my best comfort pick, so that's the reason why I chose that. And then Taran, really well known for using Zacian, Kyogre, or Whimsicott. So a lot of the top 8s that you see are just comfort picks where players have just been like, oh, I know this team's in and outs. I can make slight edits to the team in order to perfect it right now for what the meta currently has to offer. And yeah, it just really showcases right here.
Well, once again, it's interesting because in terms of restricted pairings, you actually have a good amount of diversity, right? Calyrex Groudon, Zacian Kyogre, Palkia Calyrex, Lunala Groudon. And so there's still a lot of restricted pairs that are viable at a high level, right? Top 4 actually featured 4 different restricted pairs. But at the end of the day, for a lot of these high level players, it's what they're most comfortable with. I think just some interesting things to call out here. At 9th place, Dawei C had a Celesteela set, which featured, it was like leftovers with Leech Seed and Flamethrower, so kind of like the old Celesteelas. And to their credit, actually, I believe they lost their Zacian midway through day 2 because of a team sheet error, and they were still able to finish 9th place, which I thought was really impressive given the circumstances.
Yeah, they were able to get some wins. It was actually pretty hype. I think there is a side stream match that is on YouTube, so it's a very fun set to watch.
If you look at some of the other teams, Ragov Malavia using Charm on Whimsicott, which we had seen on stream at Milwaukee Regionals. Wolfie running Lunala Groudon, but a slightly faster variant than what players might be expecting to see. Kyle Livinghouse here running Mimikyu, which I think is kind of like an anti-Trick Room option. Alex Stilla I might be mispronouncing his last name there, but he's been maybe the most prominent Reshiram and Calyrex Ice Rider player, getting top 8 at EUIC with it, and then also bringing it here. He was maybe, in my memory, the first player that I saw that really brought this duo to kind of the mainstream. So continuing his impressive run with that duo. Thomas from France using the same Shedinja team that he's been dominating the season with and won regionals with. And then there are some interesting, I would say, archetypes that don't see too much other representation within this top 32s, like Jesse Romulo using Dialga and Kyogre. He had a Diddle on that team. And then William Marks using Yveltal Zacian with Colossal, which I know Sam Pindell is the world's runner-up from 2017. Actually, won a regionals in Australia with. And then Marcus Thatcher using Gothitelle with Zacian and Kyogre as well. But outside of that, I'd say for the top 32, it's all, very kind of run-of-the-mill teams that you'd expect to make it that far.
Yeah, I think what was interesting was the story at NAIC, where I believe 7 out of the 7 players who had travel stipends or awards to the event actually did all make it to the day 2 of this event. So I mean, that's a very interesting note right here. But yeah, from personal experience, I felt like at this event I faced a lot of what you would expect to see. I think the only restricted duo that was very uncommon was my round 2, when I faced a Zekrom Kyogre, which was pretty interesting. But otherwise, I felt like I faced mostly Zacian Kyogres. I faced a few Groudon teams, and yeah, most of them were pretty much what you would expect to face at this event.
Basically, now you combine this with the results of Japan Nats and some of the other Nats that we have covered, and it leads to a really interesting story at Worlds, where it's do NA players just rely on comfort, or do they try to build something completely out of the ordinary and make a meta call for Worlds, right? I think Worlds is always interesting because obviously it's the event that you want to do best in. It's the event that you want to win, obviously. But in this format, how confident are players in their ability to actually win the tournament or make a deep run with something that is already very well known and established versus, making a complete meta call and trying to really counter the metagame? I think countering this metagame is harder than ever because there's just so many viable options. So I do expect a lot of players to rely on comfort and continue to maybe just take the teams they've been playing all season, adapt it a little bit. But I think it'll lead for this really interesting clash when we're at Worlds, where you have players who are using really obscure, crazy duos that people have no experience against, right? Yveltal Lunala, who would have ever practiced against that unless you played Shoma on ladder? Or you'll have players just using things that they've mastered truly from, day 1 of the metagame. And I think the story for Worlds is going to be so fun this year.
Yeah, especially since I think what's really interesting to note, especially for Japan, you had all these crazy teams, but the one that came out on top was basically what you would commonly see, Torn, Kyogre, Zacian, which we saw get second at EUIC, and we get second at NAIC. So I think it's just pretty interesting about how just Tornadus, Zacian, Kyogre, the biggest win that I did get was Japan Nats with second place on the other. So it's just funny because I feel like mostly Groudon has won most of the events outside in general for the most part, but the Kyogre Zacian has just been super consistent, I feel, in the long term. So I'm kind of curious if players will just go for the consistency with that. And there's of course reasons why you go for like Kyogre potentially over like a Groudon. Groudon of course really strong. Precipice Blades is its best move though, a little bit inaccurate, but its partners of course absolutely incredible, Venusaur and Charizard. So it's just going to be pretty interesting, I think, to see here like which ones will be out top. And yeah, I think also we talked about this before in our early picks in the meta, but Zacian, where Zacian I think had its probably strongest placement out of any national in NAIC, while everywhere else basically didn't have as many Zacians out there. So I'm kind of curious on how will Zacian do at Worlds. We've been talking about this for quite a bit, so will it actually do well at this Worlds, or will it be the Xerneas story once again, where Xerneas was one of the most dominant Pokemon I think in 2016 and 2019, but fell short from not making even to the finals of both World Championships. So kind of curious on how that will be affected.
Yeah, it also reminds me a little bit of Mega Kangaskhan in 2014, although like back then you obviously only had one Mega, and so like Kangaskhan was really heavily countered at that World Championships. Like I think only one player was in the top 16 with it, and I think I was maybe the second best placing Kangaskhan player at 4-2 at like 18th place, which is a testament to how well players countered Kangaskhan that year at Worlds, with a lot of players using Mawile, Lucario, Charizard, and obviously Seijo winning with Gyarados. And so yeah, I think like in this format it's a little bit harder to counter just Zacian, right? Because Zacian's always going to be paired with something that's also really powerful, but I think Zacian Kyogre established itself clearly as the #1 duo, especially after NAIC. And so I think a lot of players will have that as like the #1 duo to beat and make sure their teams have answers to it. The question is, how many answers can you have into it without compromising your matchup against everything else, right? And so, yeah, I think even just comparing like Japanese Nats to NAIC, like I'm really excited to see like the Japan versus US clash at Worlds this year. And I think the games that we get between players from both regions there are going to be bangers, especially.
Yeah, and Europe's been showing up doing really well at all their events that they've been competing in, as well as like I believe Japan has the most World Championship wins in US history, or not US history, in VGC history in general. I think they're like one win above the US right now, but it'll be pretty interesting if who will actually take the title, because maybe it'll be China, for instance. They've been having a really strong uprising recently in their players. I just think it's going to be really interesting to see how like all these different, especially in this format where it's just so volatile, like will we just see even crazier levels of just mastery of the team, slight edits, pushing as far as it can, or did they already push it? Did it peak? Do they have to come up with something else? I think that would be really cool to see.
Yeah, I honestly can't wait. Like, it's going to be amazing as a spectator, I think. And this Worlds, in my opinion, is by far going to be the hardest one just because of the number of skilled players that have qualified. Players increasingly get better and better at the game, but this metagame is also just so hard to solve, in my opinion. You can never truly solve a metagame, but this one is like, it's hard to wrap my head around because there's so many things that are viable and good. And there are also so many unexpected things that we'll run into throughout the course of a tournament. So I think that wraps it up from James and I here for this metagame overview. I think we'll probably try to do another one before Worlds, and once Worlds gets closer, kind of a sense of what maybe we expect top players to bring. But as always, if this is something you enjoyed, it'd be really helpful if you left a like or gave us any feedback. And thanks so much as always for watching.